Now you're going to hear what is, I think, one of the best investment stories that I've come across. You all know that I read a ton about investing and real estate and everything, and this is right up there. We're going to jump right in, and I want to welcome out to the stage my friend Simon Wagner of Granite Oak. Okay. So Simon's a pretty humble guy, and so it took me a while to get what I'm going to tell you in a moment out of him. And it actually, I think, started at a conversation last year at Reconvene is probably the first, right? And we were at the Jonathan Club, and we start talking, and he tells me he's here from Ireland, and I'm obviously incredibly flattered that you've come all this way, and I start asking you, as I often do, what part of the business are you in, and you start to tell me the story, and like the longer the story goes on, the more jaw-dropping it is. So let me just start by saying that Simon and his team at Granite Oak have compounded somewhat less than $1 million into a portfolio worth $250 million over the course of a little bit more than 10 years, which is 50%, north of 50% IRR for more than a decade. Turning Simon, and we're going to hear about his upbringing, which is modest, I think is a fair way to describe it, into one of the largest private landowners in Ireland. So let's jump right into how this happened, and I think people are just going to be blown away the same way I was. So tell us where you're from and what it was like growing up.
So I was born and raised in Germany, in the western part, very close to the Iron Curtain, so sort of the end of the known world at that time, back in the 1980s, because you couldn't go to the other side. Very small town, 800 people, agricultural background, not me personally, but sort of the region where I grew up in. Guess no one in my family had completed 12 years of schooling before, and
I think you told me that everyone's greatest ambition was to work at the car factory. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. The biggest business in the region is BMW, and let's call it the aspirational job would have been to stand on the assembly line, and those are good jobs, right? And that would have been what most people wanted to do, and the really successful ones managed to do it. Yeah.
So so that's the kind of the milieu that you find. So how do you go from there to here? What was the first step?
Well, so on the continent in Europe, in school, a big deal is foreign languages. I had Latin as my first one, English as my second. I was failing both, and couldn't go anywhere to learn Latin, but English, you can go somewhere. And so I decided, look, I'll decamp to the United States and learn English.
So you did like a school year abroad?
That's
basically.
right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, but things got more interesting once you got there.
Yeah, I was lucky to be placed with a family in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and got along with them really well. Enjoyed school. It was, a very positive environment. As well, maybe you guys don't know because you are from here, but the nurturing environment that you guys grew up with is not something that I was used to. I really liked it, and figured out a way to stay and graduate from high school. After a lot of trials and tribulations and false starts, my foster family, as they call them, and I figured out the easiest way is that they just adopt me. So that's what we did.
Okay, so you work your way over to Virginia Beach, Virginia, get yourself adopted,
that's
so
right,
you can stay in the United States.
That's right. Yeah.
And then you get into college. Where'd you go to school again?
University of Virginia. Yeah.
Okay, so was it at Virginia that you were exposed to finance for the first time?
I guess, look, like most people, my first exposure was when I was a child and bought my first bond when I was 8 years old, so.
That's not that usual.
So, yeah, and I remember, it was whenever I bought it, I was 8, when I got it back I was 9, and I made $100 or so of interest, and I was like, wow. this is more money than I got all year from everyone, and I had to do nothing for that, right? So, so that was
The
that was sort of
beginning
the
of a capital-
eye-opening moment, yeah, if you will, yeah.
The beginning of a capital allocation
Yeah,
career.
exactly.
Okay, so so by the time you got to Virginia, then you were
Yeah.
confident that you did want to go into
Oh
finance.
yeah, for sure. I mean, that was one of the big motivations of going there. They have a good undergraduate business school, and so that's
Okay,
what I did.
and then and remind us what year this is. This is
2001 to 2006.
okay. So for all of us, all of us older people remember that this was like the boom leading up to what became the GFC. Simon is making his way to Wall Street in 2006, 7.
That's right, 6,
Okay,
yeah.
like right at the absolute peak. And what were you doing there on Wall Street?
So I was a mortgage-backed securities trader on a on a prop trading desk at Morgan Stanley, which was, you know, the really, really hard, cool, hot seat for, you know, up-and-coming young hotshots to take, right? So, yeah.
And for those of you who are a little younger, like that was the white hot center of what became the nuclear explosion that destroyed the world economy a year or so later. So
Yeah.
so you're involved in trading these things and analyzing them, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So prop trading desk, which isn't something that really exists anymore on Wall Street, was essentially an internal hedge fund, right? You would use the bank balance sheet to make directional or whatever bets with that capital, as if you were at a hedge fund, but you had LIBOR plus 0 funding. So it was pretty good.
And the reason that this no longer exists on Wall Street is because
Yeah, exactly. So one of the reasons is the group that I was in blew up very spectacularly, featured in many popular movies and books and so on, and almost sunk the entirety of Morgan Stanley within 12 months of my arrival. Not that I had anything to do with it, right? Just to be clear here. So, but they lost just shy of $10 billion in 2007. Yeah.
okay. So and your group, which had been relatively large, gets sort of like winnowed away, right?
Yeah, that's right. There was something 80-some people in there, and within 18 months, there were 8, and then there were 4, and then at some point, there was me. So.
Okay. So you're like you come in, the place spectacularly melts down.
Yep.
Everyone's gone.
Pretty much.
But you are familiar with these financial instruments that you all had been trading.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And so talk to us about what happened to the pricing of those things and the opportunity that you saw as a result.
Well, so most of my job at that time was to manage the portfolio down. The group had about $100 billion of balance sheet. I was transferred to London at the time. The London balance sheet was a part of that, and then they kept dumping more and more other bad risk in. Anyhow, along the way, you learn a great deal about these instruments, and sort of around 2010 or so, I was still there, pricing just started to bottom and finding its foot, so to speak, and by the time I left in 2012, the bottom of the capital structure, as they call it, or the bottom pieces would have gone from trading at 5 cents, 10 cents to maybe 20 cents, 25 cents.
So, but these things had been $1.
Oh yeah.
Then they went down to 5
exactly.
cents,
Yeah.
and now they've started to sort of slowly
That's right.
recover.
That's
and
right.
you see an opportunity.
Yeah, that's right. So, and that was all at the, let's call it institutional capital size level, right? Like you had big hedge funds out of the United States, but also in Europe, starting to buy these, allocating capital towards these. But when I left, what I noticed is that the small pieces that were floating around, especially in sort of the European secondary bank market, hadn't started picking up, right? Because when you call Morgan Stanley, you call Goldman Sachs, the trading desk, and you want to sell a few $1 million worth of these bonds at 10 cents, it's already not a lot, right? It's 200, 300 grand. But if you call them and you want to sell $50,000 at 5 cents, that's $2,500. They just won't deal with you. I mean, it's not worth their time, right? So those things were stuck, and I basically started buying them because I knew this stuff, right? And I didn't have a lot of money, but everything I had and everything I could borrow and everything I could get from anyone, I used to buy these things, yeah.
Okay, so you're convicted at a time no one else is
Yeah.
about these little junk, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's not junk. But
Well, I didn't think it was total junk, but some of it was.
Some of it was.
Not all of it, though, right? So,
okay, so you beg, borrow, and steal every single dollar that you can get
Yeah, that's right.
to load up on this stuff.
That's right.
And what starts to happen?
Well, I guess, mind you, this is a relatively short window as I was between jobs, but nothing happens right away, by the way, right? You buy this, stick it in, sit on it, and then over time, though, those things actually, not all of them, but some of them then pay off at par, right? And if you go from 5 cents to par, you make 20 times your money. And that doesn't happen very often before it really starts, being a lot of money, I guess.
And I want to, okay, so you're 20xing your personal
Yeah,
capital, right?
that's
Like
right,
you've gone all in and you on this opportunity that
That's right, yeah.
most people don't see, and you're 20xing your capital. Okay. I want to talk, because it ties into what we're talking about later.
Yeah.
I want to talk about what we were talking about upstairs, which is the asymmetries of risk and reward, because I think that's a through line through what you've done.
Well, I guess, a lot of these things are, like they're bets, right? And there's a probability that when you buy something in these very highly levered capital structures at 5 cents on the dollar, that's, 90 times levered sometimes or whatever it may be, that you lose all your money, right? It's just a donut. And a lot of people are not comfortable with that, even if on the flip side, it's a 10 or 20x return. And, in my opinion at the time, it was at least a 50-50 shot, right? And if you take 50, 10x up or 50, a donut, it's a 5x outcome, right? It's a pretty damn good bet to take. But a lot of people just don't like those bets, right? They just don't like donuts, and they don't like thinking about losing all their money. And I guess I never cared enough about money that I didn't really mind it, right? So that's sort of, I mean, it's a kind of an, yeah, just
Well,
part
we're
of
going to
the
come
trade,
back to that, because I mean, you don't compound less than $1 million into a $250 million portfolio without taking a bunch of those kind of bets.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll talk about how that works later on. Okay, so you've left your banking seat. This major for you investment that you've put together is starting to really pay off. What do you do next?
Well, so I guess I was, trained as a mortgage bond trader, so I got myself a mortgage bond trading seat with a large New York-based hedge fund. It's not around anymore, but at the time they were quite successful, and they needed someone to do this in London, right? So I took that job. As it turns out, the market essentially disappeared within months of me starting that job, so there were no more mortgage bonds to trade, really. They changed a bunch of the rules. It's kind of archaic field, but essentially there was the banks didn't want to do this anymore because of the capital rule changes. So I had a job with nothing really to do.
So what'd you do?
So I cast around a little bit and said, what do I know? The core of the mortgage bond trading is sort of figuring out, correlation between assets and structures and so on. That's, kind of worthless in normal life. But I knew a little bit about real estate lending, because ultimately what goes into these things is our loans, right, secured on real estate. And so after a few false starts, I set up a mortgage lending business, commercial mortgage lending business focused on Ireland, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is a small European country, sort of out almost in the Atlantic Ocean, English-speaking, growing population, very friendly towards foreigners. I'm, a foreigner there, and got extremely badly hurt during the financial crisis. They had about 16, 17 banks, just an example, right, that were doing commercial mortgage lending in 2005. By 2010, there were 2 left. Everyone else or all the others had either gone bust or left the market. Those 2 were nationalized, and nationalized banks don't really do anything. So there was no capital available for lending. And what had happened during that time as well is that a lot of the bad loans, or the owners of the real estate, that are underwater massively, their loans sort of sat in a bank that went bust. Nothing to worry about, right? Like, bank doesn't do anything once it busts. Then they went to NAMA, which is the National Mortgage Administration, which is sort of the Irish, or was the Irish bad bank. Again, government bureaucracy, and they're really nice people, just to be clear, but they don't sort of, punish borrowers, right? And then all of those loans eventually were sold to largely US PE hedge funds, right? big names that you're all familiar with, Cerberus, Apollo, whatnot. But those guys aren't in the business of sitting around doing nothing. So there was all of a sudden, this is sort of 2012, 13, there was a lot of movement in the market where borrowers that had been more or less hanging on for dear life, but without a lot of pressure, all of a sudden got a lot of pressure on them and needed to figure out how to resolve these situations. And I guess that was sort of my cue on coming in and trying to do something about that.
So I also want to say, I mean, so that obviously the debt market is screwed up.
Oh yeah, totally.
Completely screwed up.
Yeah.
But also, crucially, and I think part of the reason that we're going in depth into this is because I believe that there are some parallels to the situation that we may find ourselves in over the next couple of years. There's also a lot of the developers have tarnished their reputations, right, as a result of
I mean, the market structure there prior to the financial crisis was, I mean, they had some, life insurance owners and so on of real estate, but a lot of it was individuals that owned and developed real estate, and they were very, very highly levered, right? And it sort of doesn't matter how much money, how many assets you have. If you're 90% levered, even if you're worth $1 billion, a 10% drawdown makes it zero, right? And that's essentially what happened, right? Which then meant pretty much anyone with a long history, not everyone, but 90+% of the entire industry wiped and defaulted on the loans, right? Which then meant coming out of it, they really couldn't access those banks anymore, right? Because those two remaining banks, you almost guaranteed to have burned either one or in most cases both of them with your historic bad debts. And so a bank won't turn around and say, well, we just lost $100 million because of business we've done with you. Here you go, there's another 10, right? That just doesn't happen, right? So.
Okay, so you're effectively there's from a capital markets perspective, it's almost like a wasteland. You've got
it was a wasteland.
Burn borrowers, no one's providing debt.
That's right. Yeah.
And you see then an opportunity for capital to flow in there and make interesting returns.
Right.
So what did you do?
So I found two much older, experienced guys on the ground in Ireland, and we set up a commercial mortgage lending business together. The hedge fund that I was working with put in some money. I raised a whole bunch of money on top of that, set up back leverage lines with Deutsche Bank, Morgan Stanley, and so on, and put a few $100 million to work in commercial lending in Ireland, essentially.
Everyone just heard that, right? I just set up like a few $100 million lending business, just like with some phone calls and a little bit of legwork.
There was a lot of work involved, I mean, obviously, right? And at first I was, chief motivational officer, chief underwriter, chief inspector of properties, chief capital raiser, chief financial officer. I mean, we built the team up, obviously, over time and relatively quickly. But yeah, it was a lot of running around and hard work.
Tell me, and just because I think it's of interest, what kind of rates were you able to extract from borrowers?
So the all-in IRRs we were charging, and mind you, at this time, European rates were zero or about to dip negative, right? Which you guys didn't have over here, but that's kind of bonkers. But anyhow, it wasn't long ago. We were getting double-digit rates.
So you're getting double-digit rates in a world where the baseline rate is zero, basically. So just incredibly attractive lending business.
That's right.
Okay, but you don't own it.
That's right, yeah. So spun this up, poured my heart into it for a couple of years, and then at some point I kind of figured out, the way this partnership agreement is structured, I'm never going to make any money on this, and I didn't. Right? I mean, I got paid a salary and it wasn't bad, and I learned a shitload. But in terms of actually, raising or building a business with several $100 million of capital in it, and then getting a donut, that was
That's an unpleasant experience.
Yeah, it wasn't great.
Okay, so you realize at that point that you got to do something that you actually own.
That's right.
But you chose, interestingly, to not do it on the debt side.
Yeah, I mean, so two things, right? On the debt side, you just have to have a lot of capital. You can't really start lending with $5 million and be taken seriously, right? I mean, you do one deal and then you never do another one. So that doesn't really work. And the other was that, people were borrowing at what really was extortionate rates from the business that I set up. But they were still making more money than we did, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. Not everyone did, but on balance, these people were not idiots, right? So I was like, well, let me look at what they're doing. And so essentially I started doing the same thing, which is to go and take properties that were in some form of default with some either PE owner or the government bad bank or whatever it may have been, right? And essentially looked at those deals and then ended up buying them, yeah.
So just to reiterate, if you got lenders, or excuse me, borrowers borrowing at 10, 12%, obviously it's because the returns to the equity, at least they expect them to be much higher.
Yeah.
So it's like, hey, time to get on the equity side.
Yeah.
Okay, and you've got your bankroll, which is this capital that you had from your original bond trade that we talked about.
This is a few years later, right? And at that point, some of them are starting to come in, essentially, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about that first deal.
Well, so, I mean, look, I looked at tons and tons, but the first one that ended up being a successful purchase, not in all aspects and a successful deal, but it was a fine deal, but it was one that I looked at in June of 2014. It was an interesting deal in the sense that it was the only commercial property we have ever bought, but it was a commercial property in a city center location with the anchor being the largest grocery store chain, and had what was called back then a historic upward only lease, meaning every 5 years the rent would be reviewed, but it could only go up, it could never go down. And had, at that point, 15 years remaining on it. So there was a lot of warts around that. Some of the other tenants weren't paying, but I figured, look, it's an interesting deal. We didn't win the deal in June, but it was 3-4 days before Christmas that year that the guy or the organization that won the deal couldn't close on it, and it fell out a bit. And the bank that was underlying this, that had to get it off their books, wanted to get it off the books before the year end. And because we'd known the deal, we were able to jump in on it and essentially ink the deal in, I don't know, 8-9 days over Christmas, which, again, in the US, you guys aren't as lazy as we are in Europe, but like, you know, Christmas, like nothing
Shuts
happens.
down.
I mean, literally. Like,
people look at you like you're crazy.
Like they think you're absolutely insane to be doing anything, right? I remember I was in a ski town during that time, and I was trying to find someone with a printer, and I'd walk into business, and they'd be like, "No, we don't have a printer. Why are you printing now? Like it's Christmas. Go back home. You know, be with your family. Like, weirdo, get out of here. You know." So I found a lady on a bus stop who was kind enough to take me to her apartment and let me print them. And like, you know, you do what you got to do. It was literally New Year's Eve at 9 p.m. or something like that I signed it, and there was a New Year's Eve party in her apartment. They're all like, "Who's this guy?" So yeah. Anyhow, that was the first purchase. Yeah.
Okay, so that was a commercial property, which I think we would call retail, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
But you have you made your career really doing more like industrial deals, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, retail was fine. We did that. We still own the building actually to this day, and the tenants are paying, and it's wonderful. But then what we discovered is that you could get similar yields on industrial or rundown industrial, former industrial, decrepit, whatever. But ultimately similar yields, but you would get a free option that one day maybe those would become development land, which would lead to much higher density use and much higher value use. And that was not being priced in whatsoever at that time. But it still isn't much actually, but yeah.
So talk to us about that second deal, which I believe was a derelict,
yes.
a derelict industrial
Good
park.
that Moses says I never can say that word. So yeah, it was a really rundown factory building in a up-and-coming area, like using, I only know New York City in the States, but sort of like, think of Bushwick in Brooklyn. Up-and-coming area, really rundown building, something that could be sort of a Batman movie sort of backdrop kind of thing. We bought this relatively cheaply, probably in terms of the land value, under what the land value in that region of town was by about 30-40% already. And then what we did is we took it through the like zoning board equivalent, and managed to get what was an industrial zoning converted into a student housing project. And the key in that was that it was employment generating, right? And student housing, you still need a lot of people, and somehow we convinced the planning board that that was fine. The more interesting element of this is that because I'd been, a lender sort of all my career, one of the competitive advantages, and I had no baggage, right, no history, one of the competitive advantages in pretty much all the deals that we've done was that I was able to convince lenders to lend me money, which most other people didn't at the time. And I was fairly good at it, right? I knew how to talk the talk, present stuff, execute it, people liked it, right? So I was pretty cocky about it. On this one, so we bought this for 1.7 million. And a year later, I convinced a lender, not a bank, an alternative at this point, to lend us 2.5 million. So more than getting our cash back out, even though we hadn't had the planning board approval at that point. And I felt really good, right? And they wanted to do an inspection, and I said, well, it's a pile of dung. I mean, you can look at it, but whatever. There's nothing to see, right? So we show up on this thing, and we didn't have security on it because it is just a pile of rubble, basically, right? We show up and try to open the door. Key doesn't work. So one of my guys goes to the car, gets an angle grinder. This is beyond my sort of ability to deal with, right? Gets an angle grinder, saws off the back of the door, kicks it in, and we go in. It's kind of dark, you can't really see. And all of a sudden and the two guys from the lender are with us, right? So there's 4 or 5 of us standing there in the hallway, kind of looking in, can't really see what's going on. And all of a sudden, 2 guys jump out and take a swing with, I guess, a tire iron or something like that. And so we beat a hasty retreat back out and call the cops. And before the cops show up, you can see them scaling out the back, over one of the fences. And anyhow, it turns out that there was a full-blown meth lab operation set up in there that, I hadn't bothered to check because, well, why would we put security on, a piece of shit property, really, right? But yeah, the lenders were not impressed, and they ended up still doing the deal, but it took a lot of convincing that this was actually the future, of the city and this location. So student housing, security is a big deal, right? So,
but just to go back to the numbers on this one, and I think I want to connect it back to what we were talking about, the bonds. You bought this thing for $1.7 million.
Yeah.
And I think you told me that if things had gone bad, really bad, what was the downside from your perspective?
I'd say you probably would have been able to sell it as a industrial redevelopment for a last mile delivery warehouse for about $1 million, the land, right? Because there's some cost to removing what was on there. Yeah.
So that's your downside.
That's right.
But then what your ultimate upside on this was?
We sold it for just shy of $8 million, yeah, after taking all the money out as well. So the IRR is sort of through the roof, right? And this, again, is a good example why a lot of people just didn't like doing those bets. I mean, it wasn't exactly on the market, but, if you've been in and around this industry for a while, anyone else could have bought this pretty much. I mean, it wasn't that expensive, and it was a pretty straightforward deal in many other ways, but people just don't like losing money, so.
So through that deal, and then obviously a series of subsequent deals,
yeah.
You're compounding that original capital.
Yeah.
To the present day, we're talking 250 million.
Roughly, yeah.
Roughly,
yeah.
With a little bit of leverage on it, but
yeah,
not
not a ton, but a bit, yeah.
And you haven't to this point taken outside capital.
No, we have not. No.
Yeah, okay. No. But you see an opportunity at this point.
Yeah. So I guess take a step back, right? So Ireland, great financial crisis, we already covered. There's basically no financing. The people who know how to run real estate, a lot of them went bankrupt, sort of lost the spirit. Nothing happens basically from 2009 to 2019. You have a decade of nothing getting built, and I mean nothing getting built. While it is the only Western European country where the domestic population is growing, I mean, people still, get married, have kids, and which is what you guys all consider normal, but the rest of Europe just doesn't do anymore. And you have immigration on top of it, right? You have a lot of foreign direct investment coming in, pretty much all the US, I mean, this big tech giants that you all, have on the West Coast here, When they come to Europe, they set up an office there. There's a very attractive tax regime in Ireland, and again, it's a very welcoming country towards foreigners, and it's a great place to then hire staff from all over Europe to service the rest of Europe, right? So you have immigration, both in tech and pharmaceuticals, by the way. You have domestic population growth, and you have nothing being built, and I mean nothing. No hotels, no industrial, no housing. So today, you have a situation in the country where you have, and it's a small country, right? You have 5 million people, 2 million households, and a shortage of accommodation of about 250,000 units. So it's a real problem. It is the only political topic. I mean, partially that is also because it's a neutral country without an army that doesn't get sort of entangled in anything, so they don't have the distraction elements that other countries have. But it is the biggest political topic. It is a real crisis on the ground for people, but it's obviously for people in our industry a real opportunity. That's just on housing, right? The same is the case for industrial. There's a massive shortage, which was compounded by Brexit because Ireland was sort of serviced as an adjunct of the much bigger UK economy. That link is not as fluid anymore, so you need more local warehousing. Tourism is booming across Europe. Again, Ireland's a great place to visit. I highly recommend it for everyone. It's easy doable for a short trip because you can pass US immigration in Dublin and then you have a domestic flight back home. Very few hotel beds have been built in the last decade. So there's an enormous opportunity to do really anything in this industry. That's the opportunity set. On the other hand, we, as Moses mentioned, we bought a lot of Class B industrial with a view of it, well, fixing it up, doing the tenant work and so on, and those are wonderful properties to own. But the very, very long-term vision was that at some point these things would become rezoned into redevelopment, mostly residential because of said housing shortage. And we bought a lot of this from sort of 2016 to 2019. We didn't buy anything during the COVID craze because prices just got a bit too hot for us. And we expected to sit on this and wait for 10 years and it would be rezoned. Well, lo and behold, everything's been rezoned. So we can build about 10% of the annual production of housing needed in the country just on our own estate. That's like, we can invest easily $1 billion doing that. So we're kind of busy with what we have, but there's new deals and new opportunity coming in. And so I've built a team. We have 20 people at this point. They're young, hungry, well, not all young, but they're all hungry and ambitious, and I want to be able to do more stuff with them. So yeah, so we are in fundraising mode, as you say. So,
Simon, thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thanks very much.